Welcome, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or Ifes, in this discussion series on democratic resilience in Europe during the pandemic. Ifes is a non-profit, non-governmental organization that assists electoral processes broadly defined across the world, and we have supported elections in European countries since the late 1980s. This is the 12th installment in our series, and so far we have dealt with issues ranging from election administration to inclusion in elections, enhanced cybersecurity, disinformation targeting women in politics, and abuse of state resources. I'm Magnus Öhman. I'm the Ifes Senior Political Finance Advisor, and I'm also Director of the Ifes Regional Europe Office in the Czech Republic, and we are hosting this discussion. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices, and is made possible through the generous support of the American people. So this time we focus on electoral justice. The effective resolution of electoral disputes is a central part of the integrity and the legitimacy of any election. But in recent years, an increasing number of politicians in many countries have cast doubt on the integrity of the electoral process. And the pandemic has added challenges for the holding of elections that truly represent the will of the people. To learn more about electoral justice, we have with us prominent experts on electoral and political processes. First, I will explore the dynamics of electoral justice in Europe during the pandemic, together with the Ifes Vice President of Global Strategy and Technical Leadership, Chair Vickery. Then we will focus on electoral justice in individual countries. And first out is Irena Hadziabdic, who is a member of the Central Election Commission of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We will look at electoral justice in Serbia together with Emilija Orestijević, who is the project manager at the Center for Free Elections and Democracy in Serbia. And finally, Rafa Rubio, professor at the Complutense University in Madrid in Spain, will talk to us about electoral justice from a Spanish perspective. And given his wide experience, I will also ask him to compare electoral processes and electoral justice in Europe and in Latin America. We will then open for questions to our panelists and for comments. If you have any questions or comments, you can already now type those in using the Q&A function. So first, let me turn to Chad Vickery from Ifes. Chad, elections are increasingly being contested. The most recent was the Armenian election last Sunday. And sometimes these complaints are successful in overturning the results of an election, like we saw in Kenya, for example. Where do you see electoral justice going in the near future?
Sorry about that. First of all, Magnus, thank you for having me. It's a very interesting question, and it is something that we're seeing globally. Across the world, we're seeing parties and candidates challenge elections, and I do believe it's important to mention Kenya. What happened in Kenya was that the court actually overturned elections based on the fact that the Election Commission did not follow proper rules and regulations. This is new, or it was unique at a time when prior to this, a plaintiff or someone who filed against an election result had to prove there was enough fraud or mistake to overturn the election. Where this was really, and I'm really reducing this, it's a very complicated case, but it was reduced to there being questions of the administration of the election. And what this is doing, and I think we're going to see this as a trend, or we are seeing it as a trend across the world, is that courts are being more assertive and more problematic, as we're seeing candidates and parties are using now the election complaints process as just another political tool to raise doubt in elections, to raise doubt in democracy, and to challenge the outcome of elections. And we cannot allow the only election that'll stand to be a perfect election. There are no perfect elections. We have to capture the will of the people, and we have to do it as fair as possible. But it is concerning to see this trend of any doubt in the election administration leading to an overturn of the election results.
There's much talk about the pros and cons of using technology in elections. How is technology influencing electoral justice?
You know, that's an interesting question, and it ties into the topic of today, which is how the pandemic and COVID-19 has influenced this process. I think when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, courts were actually unable to function as they have in the past, with hearings, open hearings, public hearings, and lawyers in front of judges trying cases. To actually resolve this issue during the pandemic, courts have turned to technology for some judicial proceedings, which has been good in many ways. Many courts have adopted e-filing and the digitization of court documents, and motions and hearings are done electronically. Most recently, the Electoral Tribunal in Mexico had open live streaming hearings for election complaints. The South Africa Election Court has done the same. And so this could be a more permanent solution to transparency and allowing citizens to file complaints and see how the complaints are being adjudicated. Another thing that was interesting about this is I think we have seen across the world that lawyers and judges in some places are very reluctant to embrace technology, but this has pushed them to actually accept technology and move us in a new direction and see that they can actually use it. One really interesting example is, as we all know, the selection of the judge that's going to hear a case may really be political or problematic. And one thing that technology can do is make the selection process to be very transparent, so people can see how judges are selected and who's being selected to hear a specific case. There are some drawbacks, however, like introducing any technology in elections. There's limited trust in technology. People think that it can be manipulated. It may underdo due process if it's not actually allowing parties to give full, to challenge people who are testifying against an election result, and actually be able to hear cases in person and argue a case. It also, two other very quick things that we have to be very cautious of. This also can further push the divide between those who have access to technology and those that do not. And in an election, everybody needs to have access to the complaints adjudication process, and we don't want this to be a further dividing point. And I think in particular, in many countries in which we work, access to technology may be readily available in a city, but not in rural areas. So we have to make sure that this doesn't restrict access to those who have technology and who are in cities.
Chad, in the previous installment of this series, we addressed the then upcoming elections in Cyprus from the perspective of sexual politics and the LGBTQ community. If we take a broader view across Europe, what are the key challenges for an LGBTQ person wishing to run for office?
You know, we've seen a resurgence of anti-LGBTQ legislation in the last couple of years, like the law passed by the Hungarian parliament recently that criminalized any positive depiction of same-sex relationships and transgender people, with the justification that it would protect children, which dangerously conflates homosexuality with child abuse. Some would say that this is an attempt to distract from scandals in Orbán's government. His goal is to demonize an already marginalized group. And these types of anti-propaganda laws made famous in Russia in 2013 are particularly consequential for the LGBTQ community. Candidates now risk prosecution for having just to stand up to say that they are gay when they campaign themselves, to say nothing of a broader chilling effect of the LGBTQ potential candidates that may decide there's too much risk to run and then they wouldn't even come out and declare that they're gay, nor would they try to run. This is a very troubling trend that we're seeing across Europe and in much of the world.
Thank you, Chad. Okay, final question. What is Ifes doing to assist efforts to improve electoral justice across the region?
I think for this audience, we are doing a great deal. There's a lot of research that we do on comparative electoral processes to let others know how they can handle questions like this, or to see how courts are handling difficult questions that are coming their way. And so we do have a database. It's the Election Judgments database, which you can find online or through Ifes's website, which actually provides cases. We go through, we analyze cases based on topics. A judge or an adjudicator or a candidate can go and see how a case was argued and decided in many countries, because I do believe many of these trends that we're seeing are ones that we're seeing across the world, and learning from one another and trying to figure out what's the best way to protect human rights and to make sure the elections are fair, transparent, and capture the will of the people are really reflected in some of these judgments. So I think both training, working with countries, and providing this information is largely what Ifes is doing at this time.
Thank you very much, Chad Vickery from Ifes. We can add very quickly that a few weeks ago, Ifes, through its Regional Europe office, organized a workshop on electoral dispute resolution for election management bodies, and the EMBs from 6 East European countries participated in that. Okay, so let us now look at electoral justice in individual countries in Europe, and turn first to Bosnia Herzegovina and Irena Hadziabdic, who is a member of the Electoral Commission in that country. And well, let's just start from the beginning. What is the main focus of your work, and what have been the biggest challenges that you have faced during elections?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak at your webinar. As you know, I'm commissioner since 2007, so a lot of election cycles are behind me. But our main focus is not just to conduct elections, local, parliamentary, general and local elections. We also are working on political party finance auditing. And we had the last elections last year, 2020, and I have to underline that these were the most challenging elections so far for me, and I can guarantee you for my colleagues. We had to organize everything under unpredictable circumstances without logistic and financial support. Actually, due to pandemic, we got completely new situation. Our staff work at home. It's so difficult to conduct elections if you are not allowed to actually come to your office. It's also incredibly difficult for political participants because they cannot, for example, freely collect signatures. So all those were unpredictable challenges. And we actually usually get funds for elections in January. Now we needed more funds due to pandemic. So our state budget is approved 6 months later at the end of July. And this complicated and complex process actually requested me to, for the first time, adopt an enormous amount of decisions on the Central Election Commission level. And at the same time, we faced the highest number of appeals.
Thank you for that introduction. Could you elaborate a little bit on the substance of those challenging decisions, and how did these cases end up in the second instance court?
Well, I already mentioned actually that we had to postpone the elections, and instead of having them in October, we had them on November 15. The biggest problem we had with out-of-country voter registration, which is actually an active process, and we received more than 1,050 hundreds applications, and most of them were duplicate. And at the end, we registered around 100,000 voters, and we denied almost 30,000 voters with their applications. The main reasons why we did that was because some applicants applied for the deceased persons. Some applications were not sent properly through this electronic, let's say, submission. We received maybe daily more than 30,000 emails from abroad. So it was so difficult actually to go through all these forms and to make proper decision who will be registered for elections. At the end, we received more than 3,000 different petition submissions. Some of them ended at the second court level, which is in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the court of BH, an appellate division of this court is dealing with our appeals, and they had to solve in 3 days 1,304 appeals related only to out-of-country voting. We, of course, in the whole process, I think 1,500 appeals ended at the court. And we have the strict deadline that we have to finish elections 30 days after election day. That means that you cannot have, that you cannot extend this process. So it was an enormous amount of work here in Central Election Commission to prepare requesting response to each appeal, and it was also probably terrible work day and night at the court of BH level.
How many appeals did you receive in total in the elections?
Well, we usually receive different, we receive some formal appeals, and it's very easy to deal with that. But a lot of political parties, and I have to tell you that for the last elections, we had 124 political parties, and together with independent candidates and with coalitions, we ended with more than 500 political entities who were running for elections, and each of them complained. So officially, 105,000 complaints ended at the second instance court, but some of them we accepted on the Central Election Commission and found that they have some legal base, so we overturned some decision. Usually we get a lot of appeals during the candidacy registration and political party registration, during the campaign and on election day. But this time was a little bit different.
Tell me, did you have any other challenging decisions in the elections?
I'm very proud to say that actually the Court of BH confirmed 99% of Central Election Commission decisions. But we had a challenging time with several decisions. The court overruled 2 decisions, and I can tell you a little bit about that. At the same time, we had, due to irregularities, to annul elections in 2 municipalities and to repeat elections. So this was particularly big challenge for our commission. These 2 decisions that were annulled by the Court of BH were actually connected with the hate speech. One political party produced a video, and in our opinion, it promoted hate speech. In other case, independent candidate used the hate speech against LGBT population. And we sanctioned both political party and independent candidate. But the Court of BH, for formal reasons, overruled our decision, because this they did maybe 35 days prior to the election day. In our election law, you can sanction for hate speech only in period of 30 days prior to the election day. Only you can sanction political parties and candidates only if they use hate speech during election campaign. If they do it a little bit early, it's nothing. So we simply were very disappointed, I have to say, that the court was really very formal and strict. They even didn't go to meritum and to elaborate, was it hate speech or not? They said, you cannot do it prior to the election campaign period. So election commission learned a new lesson, and now we are sending initiative to the Bosnia and Herzegovina Parliamentary Assembly, and we want to change this rule that actually political parties cannot use hate speech in the whole election period from the moment they are certified for the election. I think it would be more fair.
Thank you very much. Final question. So the overall theme for our discussion series is the pandemic that we're all living through. Would you say that the pandemic affected the judiciary in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and if so, in what way?
It really affected the judiciary and the work of judiciary. I read somewhere a statistic recently in the media that they had 16% less cases during the pandemic. But if we are talking about election-related cases, due to huge number of appeals, they increased the number of solved cases in this area for 16% as well. But the pandemic didn't have effect only on the quantity of the appeal. Of course, we received a lot of appeals from out-of-country voters, not only because we denied registration, but because some of them didn't receive their ballots because due to pandemic, the mail system failed and no one could guarantee, even if you send the ballot on time, that people who are abroad will receive it on time to send it back. So the pandemic really impacted the nature of our appeals. The second area that we received a lot of complaint was actually early campaign, because campaign moved to the social networks, and all political parties and candidates were campaigning on social networks, and you cannot control social networks properly. The problem was that actually we didn't have enough mechanism to sanction that early campaigning that was the reason for, let's say, our sanctions. And of course, we think that process of pandemic was used by some political subjects who had their members in polling station committees, because they actually used that situation as pandemic to limit the access of the observers. But the problem was that the access was denied because we have pandemic, but it was denial only to the observers from opposition parties. And that was one of the reasons why we actually annul elections and repeat them in one municipality.
Thank you very much, Irena Hadziabdic. And next we'll turn to Serbia and Emilija Orestijević, who is a project manager at the Center for Free Elections and Democracy, also known as CESID. While we talk, my colleagues will put documents explaining more about CESID and the organization in the chat. So, Emilija, CESID conducted large-scale research on electoral justice in Serbia in the elections. Can you tell us a bit more about the research and the findings?
Yeah, sure. First of all, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And many thanks, Magnus, for inviting me today and for sharing info about CESID to other colleagues. Well, CESID implemented the research with the general support of Ifes, and actually we used a mixture of approaches to analyze electoral justice here in Serbia, including here desk research, qualitative research, and we had discussions with political parties, academia, legal experts, judges, and also had a quantitative research with citizens on a nationally representative sample, as we wanted to see what do they think and how they perceive the electoral justice here in Serbia. Through this research, we actually confirmed what we thought earlier and what we found out during the observation cycles here in Serbia, as CESID has observed 28 electoral cycles so far. We confirmed actually that Serbian process of election dispute resolution and electoral justice is not completely aligned with recognized international principles of electoral justice, with transparency, fairness, efficiency, and effectiveness, which are principles that are actually Ifes is promoting worldwide. I will not go through legal provisions in detail. I can answer about these later, but I will go just briefly to explain why Serbia is not aligned completely with these principles. The first thing is, even though the right to file a complaint here in Serbia is set broadly and given to all voters, candidates and submitters of electoral lists, remedies are well prescribed, but deadlines for filing complaints are extremely short. We have 24 hours from the moment when some irregularity happens, while electoral commissions do not have a right to act ex officio on its own initiative in protecting voting rights. This means that even though our Republic Electoral Commission finds out that something happened, they do not have a right to investigate it or to decide about it if there is no complaint filed by the citizens, voter, or candidate. Also, neutrality of electoral commission is questionable here in Serbia, as these bodies are actually comprised of representatives of political parties. And the final thing is that inadequate compliance is also caused with the fact that electoral commission often lack transparency, and this is especially visible at the local level. Because at the local level, in local electoral commission, I think there's no chance that you can find some relevant documents or decisions published by electoral commission. And of course, although well prescribed, our remedies and sanctions are not adequately applied in practice, which means that both citizens and bodies managing elections, if they do some kind of criminal offense or irregularity, they remain not accountable in any way, which is extremely important in the perception of the electoral justice here in Serbia.
Okay, but you and CICID are experts on these issues. What about average Serbian citizens? How do they view electoral justice? Are they aware of their rights?
Well, I must say that actually, our research showed that citizens are not aware with their rights. I will go just through some statistical details. The majority of the population here in Serbia, which is 58%, holds the view that the process of election dispute resolution is good. They have trust in institutions such as Republic Electoral Commission and Administrative Court, which is a second instance in resolving electoral disputes here in Serbia. And they perceive them as efficient in resolving disputes. Of those citizens who don't see them as effective or efficient, as the main reasons, they actually identify interference, which is caused by the fact that in the REC we have political parties sitting and deciding. And of course, the lack of will of these bodies to react. But this lack of will of these bodies to react is actually caused by the fact that only 10% of citizens here in Serbia know how to file a complaint. 3 or 4 citizens do not know who has the right to file a complaint. And this means that only 24% of citizens aged 18 plus, we only interviewed those citizens who have active voting rights. Only 24% of them know that they have a legal standing for filing complaints. But the main issue, which was extremely visible during the 2020 June elections, is that out of 19% of citizens, which is around 200 from our research, who were exposed to one or more irregularities during June 2020 elections, out of them only one person reported it. And they reported it to an NGO and not to bodies who have competencies to react in protection of electoral justice here in Serbia, which for me means that citizens are not aware of their rights and therefore that they do not participate adequately in protecting voting rights. And this is important as we have in mind the fact that our laws have not been changed for 20 years in terms of those citizens who have the right to file a complaint and to act in this way. And this is why we developed a set of recommendations to improve this thing and to change something, but we can discuss about it later on.
So I asked Irena Hadziabdic about the impact of the pandemic on electoral justice in Bosnia Herzegovina. I'm asking you the same thing. What impact did that have in Serbia?
Well, I first must say that our elections took place in extraordinary situation. Of course, we had COVID-19 pandemic, but we had a suspension of the electoral process due to the state of emergency, and also had a partial boycott of the elections by a number of opposition groups due to unfair electoral conditions here in Serbia. We should have elections on March 4, but the process was suspended by the REC on March 16th, 12 days after the campaign has started, and after declaration of state of emergency here in Serbia. And our elections continued only on May 11th, 2020. This caused so-called complaint pandemic. We had this funny name for the complaint issue here in Serbia, as the entire election process was actually burdened with a huge number of complaints. It is estimated that the total number of complaints was close to 6,000, which is a precedent in election practice. Of these, approximately 6,000 complaints, a total of 3 were upheld and all others were rejected or declined. Most of the objections were filed against this decision to continue the electoral activities and were rejected as untimely. And just for an example, only during 2 sessions of the Republic Electoral Commission, 909 objections were rejected. On the other hand, after the end of the election day, the REC faced a huge number of complaints, which was around 3,000. And to compare it to 2018 Belgrade elections, we had almost 200 complaints and revoting at only 4 polling places. While during 2020 elections, we had, I will repeat, 6,000 complaints, only 3 were accepted. And of these 3, 2 were filed based on administrative issue and only 1 due to a misuse of voting rights at the polling station. However, due to mistakes of polling boards, Republic Electoral Commissions annulled and ordered revoting at 233 polling stations here in Serbia. So it was a unique case here in Serbian practice. But which is also important is to say that the pandemic influenced the transparency of electoral cycle as well. We had a situation that Republic Electoral Commission decided to switch to e-sessions at one point and heavily decreased openness and transparency of the work, and also prevented the observers such as CESID to monitor the sessions, and the official results were also declared through e-sessions, which was also a unique case in Serbia. So yeah, it had enormous effect on electoral cycle here.
Thank you very much for that. And leading up to a final question, what changes do you want to see? And how can electoral justice in Serbia be improved?
Well, thank you for that question, but we do need a lot of work to improve the electoral justice in Serbia. And through our research, which was supported by Ifes, we grouped them into 4 segments following the Ifes structure, which are institutional aspects, rules and procedures, legal remedies, and education of the public. For each of them, we developed a set of specific recommendations and activities to be implemented in joint work of political parties, state bodies, civil society organizations. But as the starting point, so-called 0 recommendations, we took that participatory and coherent reform of legal and institutional framework for election administration is needed urgently. However, a lot of this can be done even though these 0 recommendations is not implemented, including the changing of deadlines, increasing capacities of bodies serving electoral justice, building capacities of political parties and things. And I would just say at the end that all of this will be publicly presented shortly at the beginning of July, I hope. And we do hope that all relevant stakeholders will find it useful and that they will show a political will to react and implement those much needed steps to improve this process. But so far, as we had a public and inter-party dialogue here in Serbia, this political will was something that wasn't present enough in order to improve this process. And I would just remind you and to those of you who do not know, we do have presidential and Belgrade elections coming in a few months, 7 or 8.
Thank you very much, Emilija Orestijević from CECIT in Serbia. And finally, we turn to Professor Rafa Rubio from Complutense University in Madrid, Spain. So during 2020, Spain had 4 different elections. What would you say are the difference between them, in particular in relation to electoral justice?
Thanks, Morgan, for the invitation, and thank Ifes. We have 4 elections during the pandemic, not only in 2020, but 2 in 2020 and 2 in 2021. In my opinion, the difference is that the initial panic triggered by the pandemic as a consequence of its virulence, but also a consequence of lack of scientific knowledge about its transmission, lead to a generalized decision to postpone election, even when this has already been called for. At the beginning, Spain joined the wave of more than 75 countries and regions with the choice to postpone election. As time went by and a perception of coping with the sickness spread, it led and increasing the number of states to revert to keeping original electoral calendars or to call for new dates for cancelled election, even if with special safety measures in place to minimize health risk. In Spain, the Spanish constitution forbids the dissolution of the Congress when the state of alarm is held. Moreover, Spanish legislation does not include the possibility to suspend the whole of the electoral process once started. But in April 2020, at the regional level, Galicia and the Basque Country postponed their elections till July 12, around 3 months. We don't have a constitutional or legal framework to this decision, but both elections were cancelled by executive orders from the regional presidents. After the liberation of the governing councils, consultation with all political parties represented in the regional parliaments, or those with large representation, as well as with the regional electoral boards. Both governments declared that the election will be called for again once health concerns had been addressed in a manner respectful with democratic practice and principles. In parallel, somehow, a legal framework to regulate the prorogation of the state of alarm was established, according to which maintenance of the state of alarm will not preclude undertaking the electoral action necessary for the celebration of election as called by regional parliaments. Both decrees demand that the new call for election be made after consultation with political parties, but the consensus around cancellation did not endure for the new call, as in both cases there was opposition to the new call. Another decision was to not restart both electoral process from the moment this had been interrupted, but to reinitiate the war process, which was relevant because, for instance, it impacted the formation of the electoral census or the possibility to appoint new candidates, coalition or electoral groups. 6 months after, in Catalonia, the situation changed, and the regional government made an attempt to postpone the election. The Central Electoral Board accepted the delay, but after a further appeal to ordinary courts, the suspension decree, and therefore the delay itself was declared illegal. Elections were thus celebrated as originally intended. Also, in the region of Madrid, 2 months after, the last election was celebrated in May 4th. Nobody tried to suspend the election for health reasons, and they were held despite the high number of infected. Complaints to electoral justice were centered around postal balloting from inside and overseas, issues related with deadlines, soliciting and employing of private messenger service in the postal vote, voting by the infected, and the formation of ballot votes and the criteria to make sure that those designated could effectively be part of them. In resume, the worst outcome after these 4 elections and several contradictory decisions, the electoral justice in Spain still didn't have a legal framework to apply in similar situations, even though there is a great need for legal regulation for electoral cancellation, given that such cancellation of election involves fundamental rights as well as the general election system.
So, Professor Rubio, one issue that's come up several times in this discussion series is the right to vote for persons who actually have COVID. I wanted to ask you, how should we perceive this issue from a perspective of electoral justice? And are you aware of any electoral complaints about people being denied the right to vote for this reason?
Yeah. In this topic, Spanish authorities have also changed their criteria, and the electoral justice have changed the criteria. In June 2020, the electoral authorities supported the ban to vote of small segments of the population for sufficiently justified health reasons, and I'm quoted, in order to avoid a suspension of election in those places with a high contagious index. In some places, the authorities even threatened to impose sanction of those infected who attempt to vote. The result was to prevent hundreds of quarantine infected from leaving their house in order to reach the polling station. The Supreme Court did sustain this ban. It's much questionable, in my opinion, that these measures respect the principle of proportionality in the limitation of fundamental rights, at least to the extent that it would have been possible to envision measures less deleterious to the rights of active suffrage than a simple and straightforward ban over the effect of quarantining. For instance, 6 months later, in the next elections in Catalonia and Madrid, the government established a specific time for these people to vote. COVID hour, as it was called, is a time when all people who have tested positive or had close contact with a positive person, and only then could vote. In Madrid, it was a little bit different because it was a mere recommendation, but it exists this COVID hour and people could go in that times. Once again, the electoral justice supports the decision to allow voting, although it recommended postal voting. I'm quoting, the right to the suffrage is a fundamental right that cannot be denied to any citizen, with the electoral authorities conclude, in my opinion, a clear contradiction with the first decision that they took in the two first elections.
Thank you very much. Moving on, you have worked a lot in both Europe and in Latin America, and therefore I would like to ask you, what would you see as the main differences, if any, between the electoral processes and, of course, electoral justice in Europe and in Latin America?
As all you already know, the difference between the different models of electoral justice are quite broad. I will underline the autonomous role of the electoral justice in Latin America against the integration of it with the ordinary courts usual in Europe. This has had consequences. An autonomous electoral judiciary emerged as a veritable power with the state, particularly during electoral context, and therefore it's difficult to locate it outside of political disputes, whether they are due to partisanship or not. In this sense, the main difference has been political tensions, in my opinion, in the last process. As Chad already said in his intervention, the complaints are a new political tool, and in different electoral process in Latin America, beyond the health crisis, electoral process has been celebrated in an environment of polarization and in a context where electoral justice has suffered a number of delegitimation attempts and a narrative about fraud, and a very close result that had complicated the situation further. In Mexico, with direct accusation against the electoral justice by the president. In Ecuador and Peru, problems regarding polls at the polling station and fast counting and appeals that have taken considerable time are good examples. In Europe, the debate has been more legalistic than political and the elections, in my opinion. Beyond initial problems that were consequence of the novelty, have remained technical rather than political. But in both regions, we have witnessed a learning process, out of which, in similar circumstances, the criteria have changed, and what at the beginning looked something impossible and almost suicidal has become something reasonable and almost normal.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you a final question, touching upon an issue that Irena Hadziabdic raised, which is online campaigning. So across the region, we've seen a significant increase. I'd say this is something that started before the pandemic and had been going on for quite some time and then increased significantly once the pandemic hit. What challenges do you see that this has for our elections and for electoral justice?
It's true that in this election during the COVID-19 online campaigning has been more important than in previous contests due to the difficulties for physical campaigning, which is why the decisions taken by electoral courts in that issues are particularly relevant. This decision can be split in 4 groups that are, in my opinion, the 4 main challenges for the electoral justice in this issue. The first one is related to the use of government social media during election that shows an increase in complaints and the electoral courts against the employment of official social accounts and web page for electoral purpose. Similarly, the use of online campaign has also generated reports for engaging in electoral campaigning and publication of polls during Reflection Day, which is not allowed in many countries. The third, and quite influential, relates to the participation of third parties in the campaign, particularly through third parties, as was the case, for example, of 15 influencers hired by the Partido Verde in Mexico. There is an increasing number of private individuals who get actively involved in campaigning, frequently anonymously and even in an automated fashion, taking advantage of social networks. Oftentimes, this participation has a strong presence of foreign actors who can influence the public debate and influence electoral results, particularly when results are very close, as we have seen. The fourth and most important, and I'm finishing, it relates to the cancellation of the suspension of accounts during the electoral period. Given the constraints over other channels of communication, it can be extremely influential and may condition the electoral result. This, from the viewpoint of fundamental rights, is transforming online platforms in veritable electoral pseudo-courts, represents a real threat for electoral justice. Moreover, it's worth remembering the nature of this platform as private, for-profit companies that make decisions according to mechanisms that lack transparency and reducing or ever eliminating the capacity of parties and candidates to defend their interests.
Thank you very much, Professor Rubio. We'll now open the floor and take questions to our panelists as well as comments. If you have any questions or comments, please type those in during the Q&A function. And while you are typing, I will read out some questions that have come in during the session today. The first question is for Emilija Orestijević, CESID. And I'm reading out the question here. Some say that many or most of the electoral complaints that were made in the last elections in Serbia were the result of an attempt to itself disrupt the electoral process. What would be your response to that?
Well, actually, there is a explanation for this huge number of complaints. The thing is that there was a Facebook page of one local organization who was inviting citizens to file a complaint and to send it to the Republic Electoral Commission, stating that this decision to continue with elections was not in line with the laws and that it was irregular. But the thing is that this invite to send the complaints, which resulted in like 3,000 or 4,000 complaints, was it wasn't in accordance with procedure because it was all of those complaints were untimely. So many political actors here in Serbia, as well as some civil society organizations, stated that this is something that is actually being done on purpose to affect the work of Republic Electoral Commission and to influence their capacity to conduct elections as they should be. In my opinion, I think that this high number of complaints was a result of citizens not being aware of their rights and responsibilities, and that it was some type of misuse of the right to file a complaint. Republic Electoral Commission had to decide on a basis of each one complaint that was sent to Republican Electoral Commission. And then we had appeals on those complaints. And I think that around 4,000 of appeals were sent to administrative court, which took more than 2 months to actually decide on all of these appeals. So we had interesting cycle with those appeals and complaints and things and returning the decisions. But at the end, except that it did burden a work of Republican Electoral Commission, it did not influence the overall result of the elections in June. Thank
you very much. We have another question that's almost a follow-up question to this, but more general, and I'll ask this to Chad Vickery, and it's a very easy one. The question is, how do we judge if an electoral complaint originates from genuine flaws in an electoral system or from attempts to discredit the electoral process?
You know, that is very easy. I think that is being able to prioritize legitimate complaints is a very difficult process. I think an interesting part in the United States gives us some examples, and there are standing rules that require you to be able to get to court. You have to prove at a certain level that there was something that went wrong, that you were injured, and that it would have some it would affect the results in some way. There has to be enough evidence to give you a preponderance of evidence that there was something that happened that makes it a legitimate claim. And I think if you have very well-defined standing requirements that you have to pass before you can get to the courts, then you can dismiss these cases rather quickly. And then also one thing that I think many, if there are bar associations in countries, you can have a rule that if a lawyer files a fraudulent case, or one that they know is not a real case, they can be fined or disbarred. So I think, but that's also very careful. We don't want to get to a point where we're using that as a tool to punish political opponents. But I do think lawyers and those that are filing cases ought to be held responsible when they knowingly file cases that are fraudulent. So you have to have clear standards to get past the first bar. And then if somebody's knowingly filing complaints, they ought to be held accountable.
Thank you very much for that, Chad. I have two questions for Irena Hadziabdic. One is specifically for the Election Commission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the other one relates to something that you were talking about earlier, which is hate speech. The first question then relates to something that we discussed with Professor Rafa Rubio about persons with COVID voting. So the question is, if people who had COVID-19 were allowed to vote in the Bosnia-Herzegovina elections, and what were the discussions around that issue, the pros and cons, as it were. The second question then is from participants in India, who has the point, hate speech is common in India and the Election Commission is not effective in controlling this menace. How can European laws and European systems impact and control hate speech?
Okay, COVID voters, voter with COVID, that was something completely new, and we realized in Election Commission that we have to do everything to provide voting rights to these people who are or sick or in isolations. And we came with some sub-regulations, and a lot of people with COVID voted, but the process as the new one had its weaknesses, let's say, and some people were really denied of voting rights, although they were on our list to vote. Why it happened? We actually, in order to provide as many of them with possibilities to vote, even if they are discovering that they have to go on isolation in election day, we said, if the voting will start at 7 o'clock in the morning, you can apply till 9 o'clock. It happened that people who are in isolation, they're not at their home. They're far from their home. They're usually going to their weekend house to isolate from their own members of family, not to contain other people. So you send the procedure was like, your ballots are waiting at your polling station. So the special mobile team has to go there to pick up your ballots and to go to find you, not close to your polling station as you should be, according to your address, but far more. So it suddenly happened that a lot of people, a lot of mobile team didn't have enough time, although we extended some of their hours to reach all the voters. And that was the biggest problem. And I think that we were too ambitious. We wanted to provide everyone with, and then at the end, we couldn't actually reach all of them. I think we have to change something. At least it has to be cut a little bit, because when you plan elections, you have to plan it carefully and have to be very well prepared. And at the end, you will never be very well prepared. And the whole process, including the hate speech, I'm going to the second question, evolved in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We had hate speech in our first election law, and we had 20 changes and amendments, and I'm now responding to Emilija. And even if you have 20 changes and amendments, if you do not have substantial changes and amendments that are going in direction of international standards, this is just a formal change and amendments, like, and nothing crucial is you're not progressing at all. So the hate speech we can sanction, and we are doing that, and we can even annul the certification of the party. But the problem is the hate speech is going on social networks, and you don't know who did it. You think it's against its a party, but then you realized you have a right to sanction party, but you cannot sanction supporters, and supporters did it. Then you change the law, put supporters. Then it's not party, it's supporter, it's some kind of supporter, but not official one. So you simply have to upgrade every elections and to look carefully at all your mistakes. Like we recognize mistakes with the hate speech that should be, actually, I think it should be logic. If you want to run the country, you shouldn't use hate speech. And now we can sanction only if you don't obey in these 30 days. This is not a proper rule. I didn't probably help my colleague from India, but I put the official website and my email and all contacts are there. So please feel free to ask me additional questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. I have received a question for Professor Rubio in the issue of Europe and Latin America. So the question is, in many countries in Latin America, elections are organized by an electoral tribunal, a court in one way or another, while in Europe it's normally done by a commission. We often call it the Central Election Commission. What difference does that make regarding elections, and of course, especially regarding to the resolution of electoral disputes?
Sorry. I think that in the Latin American model, as they create a specific organization to run the elections, and in some place they have one specific organization to run the election and one specific organization to judge the election, and they make difference between the electoral commission, if you want, and the electoral justice. It's very easy that these two powers, the electoral powers, become a real power in the country. And this is why in that process, the government tried to attack these independent powers, accusing them to be political or not to be fair. We have seen in Ecuador during months that the government, not only the government, but the parties are attacking very, very strong to the Electoral Commission. We have seen Mexico when the president and the party of the president has given the name and the direction and the address of people which are part of the Electoral Commission, trying to put the people in the door of his house to press. And in my opinion, this is the main difference. And the problem is that we have heard during the last weeks the propositions to copy the European model, but it's very difficult to copy the European model if you don't have the European culture. I don't want to be patronizing, but it's different to have an election commission inside the government, as we have in many countries in Europe, that to have an electoral commission inside the government in some of the Latin American countries, because the danger to have an electoral commission running by the government, in my opinion, is a danger for democracy.
Thank you very much for that. Another question will come in for Emilija Orestijević. You talked about political will, an issue that we come across fairly often, and that it's lacking for electoral reform in Serbia. What should be done to build that will?
It's $1 million question. The thing is that here in Serbia, we have a specific situation where we have a full dominance of one political party, which has from 250, it has like 190 mandates in the public parliament, in the National Assembly. The key thing in Serbia now is that we do not have a minimum of agreement about the electoral conditions. And I will not even speak about the reform of electoral administration or electoral system in terms of threshold and things like this. We have boycotts of political parties, boycotting previous elections with potential to boycott the following ones, and support of like 50 to 55% of citizens to one politician here in Serbia, which is legit. I do not have anything against it. But the thing is that all political decisions now are based on the current context, and there is no any other thing that we as a civil society organization can do except of advocating and insisting on the need to reform both electoral administration and the electoral system here in Serbia, and to improve it in so many ways, because there are really so many gaps and things that can be improved. But we are actually promoting this law, amendments to the law of the electoral administration and the electoral cycle since 2007. And in two electoral cycles, these laws were a step to National Assembly, to be discussed in the National Assembly. And then someone just says, okay, this is not a priority now, so we will just go like this in the upcoming period. And of course, we have these, let's say, obligations not to change anything massive in the electoral laws in the electoral year. But the thing is that we here in Serbia have the elections each 2 years. So we are a bit in a heavy situation, but all we can do as a civil society organization is to advocate, to talk about it, to keep this thing high on the agenda, and to just be boring organization which just keeps telling people about changes that we desperately need to improve both electoral justice and the electoral procedures. I'm not sure that I helped, but the situation in Serbia is really, really specific.
It is really specific, but we have panelists from very different types of institutions and different countries. So let me broaden the question. How do we build political will in general in different countries to create electoral reform and increase electoral justice? Who would like to take that on? Irena, please.
I don't have answer. I just wanted to to say first what I think, because I'm always jumping. That's not good, but we are doing improvement, regular improvement. I already complained that I don't see substantial reform. All of what I see are technical improvements in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have a lot of European Court of Human Rights decisions that we should actually implement, and it is again at the end up to the political will, not up to the election administration. And I'm always talking from the point of election administrator, and we are very aware of weaknesses. Maybe not this high-level political issue, and we even don't want to touch that. But what we really can improve is to actually cover more areas, because even if you have these high-level international standards, then when you come to this technical implementation, you can ruin a lot of things, like we denied some COVID voters of their voting rights because we simply didn't plan carefully. Actually, we planned carefully, but we are not educated. No one could be expert in 2020. We learned from each other. So I'm very thankful to you and Ifes and for such opportunities, because I'm getting some good examples, and I maybe have some lessons for my colleagues that they should do in their reform. So I think we should meet more often on different issues, like I see the question from Sri Lanka related to the political party financing. So this should be our next topic.
We'll make that our topic for a future discussion, absolutely. Rafa, Rubio, please.
In my opinion, we have to make a difference between the electoral process and the electoral system. It's easy to have a political will to change the electoral process in Spain, but it's almost impossible to have a political will to change the electoral system. And then maybe sometimes it's better to be focused in the process, and because it's very, in my opinion, it's more easy to change important things across the process and try to avoid to legislate together the process and the system, because it's almost impossible that, because at the beginning, when in Spain we start to have more than two parties, I think that it will be easy to have electoral reforms, because the small parties will try to change the system. But after 10 years, with 5 or 6 parties in the political ground, it has been impossible to change the electoral system.
Thank you very much. Chad, do you want to say a final word? Easy fix for getting political will?
This is very easy for sure. Yeah, we've definitely been looking at this question most recently with the rise of authoritarian governments and backsliding of democracy. And I think the prescription is easy to describe, but implementing it's very difficult to do. And that is hold elected officials accountable and have some incentives to do the right thing. And then I think democracies have to deliver services for citizens. I think many times we forget when we really, especially election administration, when we're really in the weeds of the difficult administration of elections, that we also have to think about, is this democracy delivering services for its citizens? And are they able to hold elected officials accountable? Many times we see the legal system is fine or it's good enough, but then there's loopholes, there's way that people can break the law and not be held accountable, and then it just slips down a way in which the incentives are to not uphold the rule of law. So I think as an international community, we really have to focus on holding elected officials accountable, incentivizing good people to do the right thing, and also to make sure the democracy is delivering for its citizens.
Thank you very much, Chad. We've come to the end of our time together. I want to thank all our panelists. I want to thank all of you for participating in this event. And I want to thank USAID for supporting this work, my Ifes colleagues for preparing and implementing this event, and our fantastic interpreters. We're going to take a break now during the summer, and our next installment will be by the end of September. Until then, I hope that you have a wonderful summer and stay safe.